We're here today with Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. Liz is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, alongside Bishop William J. Barber II. She's also the director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary. Her new book is We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign with Broadleaf Books. Liz has been named by Politico as one of the 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries whose ideas are driving politics, by Sojourners as one of 11 women shaping the church, and by the Center for American Progress as one of 15 faith leaders to watch. Her work has been published in Boston Review, Christian Century, CNN, The Guardian, Religion News Service, Sojourners, Time Magazine, and many others. She's the author of Always With Us and co-author of Revive Us Again. Liz is an ordained minister of Presbyterian Church USA and teaches at Union Theological Seminary. She and her family live in New York City. You can learn more about Liz at liztheoharis.org. That's LIZTHEOHARIS.org. So Liz, congratulations on all you've accomplished, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's really great to be able to get to know each other. Before we kind of get into your books, I'd love for you to tell people more about your background and kind of your journey of how you got from there to here.
Well, it has been quite a journey. I was raised in a family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that was deeply dedicated to the work of doing justice. My mom was a faith-based activist who really organized her life around the words of Micah 6:8. What does God require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? My father was one of the kind of foremost historians and critics of the abuse of governmental powers and federal surveillance. He really broke open the FBI. And so my whole growing up was about talking about democracy and economic justice and what we're required to do from a Christian perspective, from a faith perspective of really helping to bring God's reign of justice for all here on earth. And so I got involved in very grassroots anti-poverty organizing when I went off to college, met up with the National Welfare Rights Union and the National Union of the Homeless, organizations, movements that were led by people that were most impacted by poverty and homelessness and injustice, who were not leading just themselves, but leaving the whole nation around real solutions, effective solutions to these problems. And it was from poor and homeless families that I heard about the last campaign that Reverend Dr. King was waging as he was waging when he was assassinated, and that was the Poor People's Campaign, where he proposed and he was doing this alongside others. The welfare rights movement had been there, pushing him on the issues. Families in Appalachia, indigenous and native leaders, Jewish, Quaker, Christian, folk were on board. But he proposed, that the Achilles heel, the weak point of a system that propped up racism and poverty and militarism, was to unite poor and low-income people across all the lines that divide us. And so, decades ago, I started to think about and started to hear and learn from other folks in the community about what would it look like for us to reignite or to build a Poor People's Campaign for today. Then back in 2013, I connected up with the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. He was at the time leading the Forward Together Moral Mondays movement out of North Carolina. Years of every week nonviolent civil disobedience and action, really directed at these extremist legislatures that had kind of taken over North Carolina. And I was, connecting up with this grassroots and continued to work with this grassroots network of poor people's organizations. And so in 2016, we teamed up and went on a national moral revival tour, and then said, well, what if we kind of really join forces and build a Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival? And so we started organizing that, and we launched that campaign in 2018 with the largest and the most expansive wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the nation's history, with folks in about 40 states and state capitals all engaging in nonviolent moral fusion direct action, and coming forward with this agenda that connected systemic racism and poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and this false narrative of religious, especially Christian nationalism. And we've continued to keep on organizing. We're organized all across the country, and in nearly every state, and led by poor and impacted folk and moral leaders and clergy and activists and advocates and many different kind of people of conscience who are dedicated to building a moral movement from below. And so I direct the Cairo Center. As you said, it's one of the anchor organizations of the Poor People's Campaign, and we, in addition to helping to organize the Poor People's Campaign, have an online spiritual church for movement activists. It's called Freedom Church of the Poor, and have kind of sister congregations of Freedom Shul of the Poor for some of our Jewish siblings in the work, and Iglesia del Pueblo, which is a Spanish language spiritual home for activists as well. And we do a whole lot of work talking about confronting religious Christian nationalism, and kind of weaving together grassroots networks of those that are most impacted, coming forward with real solutions to the problems that are plaguing our society. And it's out of this that the book and so much other work comes.
Wow, what an amazing set of things that you've done. I mean, just the Poor People's Campaign alone, I mean, the way that is so broadly based, as you said, across the whole country is just really impressive and wonderful to see. And there's a big event on that front coming up in June, is it?
That's right. So on June 18th, we're holding a mass poor people and low-wage workers assembly and a moral march on Washington and to the polls. And it's going to be a generationally transformative event, but it's not just a day. It's a declaration of the kind of power that poor and low-income people are building, and the agenda that we're putting forward that takes on all of these different injustices, and poses the possibility that it doesn't have to be this way, that we don't just have to get used to working with less, that it's immoral and wrong to live in the richest country in human history and to have almost half of our population, more than half of our kids, living in or one small emergency away from economic ruin and poverty. And so, the campaign is about shifting the narrative about who is poor and why we're poor, and building power amongst these 140 million people who are poor and low income in these United States.
Yay, amen.
So, know, right?
So one thing I'm curious about, how did you get from Milwaukee to New York City?
Yeah, so I grew up in Milwaukee, and got to be connected to all kinds of grassroots organizing and activism. I went to college in Philadelphia, and that's where I met the National Welfare Rights Union and the National Union of the Homeless. The national headquarters of the Union of the Homeless had been in Philadelphia. And it's from there that I started to do lots of kind of national anti-poverty organizing, working with low-wage worker organizations and healthcare organizations. But then in the late 90s and early 2000s, I was more or less sent to seminary from the movement. Leaders in these grassroots organizations said, we have to figure out, why is it that the Bible, and one of my colleagues, Willie Baptist, says this all the time, is one of the forms of mass media that has something good to say about poor people and the poor. And yet we have kind of a heretical theology right now that justifies poverty, that says that if God wanted to end poverty, he would do so. And then kind of claims this idea that there'll be pie in the sky when we die, but we know that itself is kind of a lie, and that in fact, if we look at our sacred texts and traditions, there's a clear kind of arc of anti-poverty organizing and really kind of what God's reign is all about, and what God cares most about. And so folks had suggested, like, we need to grow some more faith leaders. And so I was sent to seminary, and I went to Union Theological Seminary because in some of the grassroots organizing and marches and events that we had done, where we had been welcomed most had been Union Seminary. When we had kind of come and presented our case as poor and homeless people across the United States and across the hemisphere to the United Nations, we were hosted by faculty and staff and students at Union. And so obviously Union also had just kind of housed so much of kind of U.S. liberation theology throughout the decades. And so I moved to New York City to attend Union. I was able to attend Union because I got the first William Sloane Coffin scholarship. That was deeply meaningful to me because as a young child, we had hosted Bill Coffin in my house.
Wow.
When he would come to Milwaukee, he would stay with my family. And so to be able to go to seminary and study at Union because folks that had been friends and colleagues and supporters of him had kind of funded the scholarship that then made it possible, was kind of a little bit full circle for me, right?
Sure.
And then I stayed in New York and stayed connected to Union because, I start going to seminary and find all of these other students and alums connected to Union who are trying to also figure out, what role faith leaders have in a larger movement, and actually put together a survey of seminaries across the country and found out that no major seminary was doing anything systematic around kind of poverty, especially from the perspective of those that are most impacted, despite the fact that the kind of first stop when a family gets evicted or when some kind of economic chaos is happening, often is religious institutions and churches. And yet our seminaries and our theological education hasn't really fully prepared faith leaders to know what to do in the face of that, especially, again, from a justice perspective, not just a kind of charity perspective. And so I moved to New York to go to Union and have been associated with Union ever since. I started what was first called the Poverty Initiative in 2003. And then in 2013, it became the Kairos Center that I continue to direct. And so it's, 2 decades basically of being housed at Union and working with religious and community leaders that are trying to build a movement that can really take on, the intersection of racism and poverty and environmental issues, militarism, and kind of come forward with I think the kind of power and the kind of vision that we see in our sacred scriptures.
Wow. Well, I can see why that's a great fit, for the work that you do. So
Yeah.
Wonderful to hear that story. It's just, really inspiring, quite frankly. So, but let's talk about books, right? And so before
Great.
we get into the new one, tell us about the things you've written previously.
So the first book that I published, I had a couple of chapters in a number of books before, but was more or less a kind of book edition of my dissertation. And it's called Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor. It's a kind of reinterpretation of what Jim Wallace and others will call the most famous passage about poverty in the Bible, which is, there in Matthew 26 and in other gospel accounts. But the poor will be with you always. And that passage itself, there isn't really a week that goes by in my life for the past 25, 30 years where somebody doesn't kind of quote that passage to say that poverty is inevitable and the best we can do is charity and Band-Aids, and the worst is to kind of punish and pity the poor. And so some of that is what actually motivated me to even do a PhD in biblical studies. I at first I would just kind of reject the notion that God is willing poverty, because that was not the God I was introduced to growing up involved in justice movements, and it wasn't the God that I read when I read these sacred texts. But I also could tell that this was like a huge biblical roadblock, a huge kind of theological obstacle to folks actually joining a struggle to end, not just manage, not just ameliorate, but actually end, abolish poverty. And so that book, again, reinterprets that one passage, but puts it into the context of the entire Bible, and sees that actually, rather than it being a story about God condoning poverty, it's actually one of the strongest passages in the Bible that says that God hates poverty, and has commanded us and shown us what we are to do in terms of organizing society around the needs of the marginalized and the poor. And that from there will mean that nations, worlds will prosper, if we kind of cancel debt and release those enslaved to injustice, if we pay workers living wages and organize society around the needs and demands of those that are at the bottom, that our whole nation, our whole world will flourish. And so I published that book. It became, a major studying text for the Presbyterian Church USA, and many folks that are involved in the movement, have been able to use many of the ideas there. And I still draw on a lot of that, and in the biblical interpretation and studies work that I do, but then also in just the preaching and organizing work. And then a couple years later, I published another book. This one alongside of Reverend Dr. Barber, and another biblical scholar, Rick Lowry. And that's called Revive Us Again, Vision and Action and Moral Organizing. It's a compilation of sermons of Reverend Dr. Barber's, and then also with kind of an intro and a framing that I put together about the kind of biblical and theological foundations for doing justice work. And part of the reason that we're claiming that we need not just a political and a social and economic movement, but a moral movement and a moral revival of our deepest, sacred traditions. And so that is more of a kind of a publication, a book that lays out, some of the vision of the moral movement, some of the moral analysis, moral articulation, and moral action that people are doing, and that kind of paves a way towards some of the work we're now doing in the Poor People's Campaign. And then this book is my third book that I've published, and then along with a lot of other kind of essays and stories and articles. And this is, and I'm very excited about it and very proud of it. It's actually a compilation of about 33 different contributors. Some of those are folks that are playing leadership roles in different, major denominations. And many are folks that are poor and low income people themselves who are playing different roles, building a Poor People's Campaign for today. And the book, We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign, takes on, it starts with each chapter, and there's 53 of them. It's kind of like a devotional, and each one starts with a quote from a justice leader. Some of them are very known folk, right? Dr. King, Fannie Lou Hamer, Bishop Tutu. But some of them are justice leaders that are maybe less known, but who have amazing insight. And then from there, introduces a biblical passage and kind of reinterprets that in light of struggles for justice, putting it in conversation with stories of poor people organizing today, and then kind of finishes each chapter off with space for prayer and reflection and further reading. And so really excited about this book.
How did it come about? what was the impetus that drove, that coming together?
Yeah, so the Cairo Center had kind of pulled together a cohort of religious leaders, but again, many of them, low-wage workers that are organizing and folks that are, without health care who've had to bury their children because they lacked health care, but are still, coming from a faith perspective and a movement perspective. So we had put this kind of group of people together, and that group started to kind of uh, talk about the kind of different ways of interpreting biblical texts and how we can put the stories of a mom wailing at the U.S. Capitol because her daughter died from the lack of health care and Medicaid expansion in her state of Alabama, in conversation with Rachel weeping for her children who are no more, and seeing how you can kind of bring it to light, um, and have a deeper understanding of what some of these biblical passages are even um, instructing us to do with our lives today, and instructing us about how wrong injustice is in our world today, and our responsibility to do something about it. And so a group of us kind of got together and said, well, we have some of these powerful stories that are not getting out there right now, and powerful biblical interpretations, including of texts that are used all the time, against poor people, against marginalized people. I mean, one of the chapters I have in there is kind of a rereading of a passage from Second Thessalonians. If you do not work, you shall not eat, right? This passage, I was raised in the church. I was a Sunday school teacher, by 13. I was a deacon by 16. I knew the Bible well. But it wasn't until the welfare reform debates in the 90s that I started to hear people quoting this chapter, this verse from the Bible, to kind of justify, well, what Paul is saying here is that poor people don't deserve to eat or to have social programs unless there are work requirements, right? And so the chapter in this book is kind of a reinterpretation of that, seeing that actually there is a strong critique. That strong critique in Second Thessalonians is of the rich in the community who are benefiting from the work of poor members of the community who aren't contributing anything. And then they shouldn't come and have communion together with the community if what they're doing is just profiting off the backs of the poor, right? It's a totally different story. It's a totally different instruction and critique than that you should start making poor moms to get their welfare checks have to work at crap jobs, right? That's not what Paul is saying. That's not what our sacred texts are teaching. But instead, the notion that rich folk and folks with significant means should not get to profit off of the poverty of others. And so there's a lot of that, right? Kind of reinterpreting some of these texts that are used against poor people, used to justify poverty and oppression, but that actually have a very different content and message.
Wow. Wow. That's very powerful. And I mean, you're right, because I mean, over the centuries, so much of scripture, so much of Christianity has been twisted, right? And so bringing us back to what, as you said, what God is really trying to convey
Yeah.
is really, really important. And
Mhm.
so, thanks for doing all the work to pull such a thing together. Um, I want to read a couple of endorsements for the book. This one comes from Cornell West. He says, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis is a towering love warrior and freedom fighter for precious poor people in the bowels of the American empire. This rich collection of essays is a powerful cacophony of prophetic voices that prefigure our beloved community. And this one from Kelly Brown Douglas. The writers of We Cry Justice bring alive the meaning and the challenge of God's preferential option for the poor for our world today. The message is clear. Doing justice is not an option for people of faith. Rather, it is the work of God. So, it's wonderful to see such people supporting your book. Why do you think that it has resonated so much with folks like that?
So I think that for too long, who has kind of gotten to say what God cares about and what our sacred texts and traditions instruct have been folks that kind of say that the real moral issues of our day are who is marrying who, um, uh, you know, kind of defending private property, claiming that Jesus was a card-carrying member of the NRA, right? These kind of ideas when, as Bishop Barber often will say, uh, the Bible and God, condemns those who pray, Pray, over those who pray, Prey, on the poor and the marginalized and the widow and the sick. And so I think that the likes of Cornel West and Kelly Brown Douglas and Eva Patel and a bunch of the folks that endorse this book, and many others who are just excited to receive it and read it, is because folks are hungry for a different moral message, and especially one coming from, those that are impacted and organizing, God's justice here on earth. And I think, what I see across the country, whether it has to do with this book or whether it has to do with the kind of larger moral organizing that we're doing, is that people do have indeed a hunger, to hear a different message, a message of love and truth and justice, and that is rooted in our scripture, that is rooted in our theology, that is rooted in decades or centuries of impacted people, those, as Frederick Douglass would say, those who would be free, striking the first blow and organizing for justice. And so I think that that's part of why folk are so excited about this, and why I'm so excited about this book as well, is because I think it has a different moral message for the nation than what we're getting. But it's one that really resonates with people's own experiences, and own theologies.
Well, I mean, that's why Christianity became popular in the first place, right? I mean, because of the aspect of the revolutionary love that
That's right.
was, portrayed by Jesus. So, I mean, what a concept. Um,
Indeed.
so here's another quote from Bruce Reyes Chow. Whether used as a personal devotional or as the foundation for communal discernment, We Cry Justice is an immediate must-have for anyone who takes seriously the biblical call to work for a just and abundant life for all of creation. So did you intend for this to be kind of used as a devotional?
Yeah, it is and I mean, it's a different kind of a devotional, right? Well, because it is, but but I- but but I think I envision that both individuals can take up this book, and again, there's 53. We know there's only 52 weeks in the year, but it gives you a little flexibility. And we have a kind of whole kind of schedule that you can follow. I mean, so there's one a week, and there's questions at the end of each chapter, but you can also, we have some suggestions for how you could kind of go back to this every day that week and really try to pray and think, and reflect on what this means for you and your life. But also, this is something that community organizations and community groups and labor unions and congregations can use as well. I've been hearing from some churches that are saying that they're going to just use this book to organize, their whole church life. So the Bible study on Sunday, the Sunday school, is focused on this. The sermon, takes up these passages.
Wow.
The weekly bulletin will have, the quote, and just using it as a way to kind of help a whole group of people, but also individuals, work through so many different texts, but from the perspective of what does our Bibles really say about these issues, and what are we called to do in the face of it all. And so so yeah, really hoping that folks both find it as a resource individually as a devotional and also kind of collectively, because I mean, you know, both to deepen people's relationship with God, um, uh, and then deepen people's commitment to do God's work out in the world.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we talked a little bit about June 18th, coming up. Looking forward, are there other book projects that you have or other kind of projects that you're able to tell people about?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to work on another kind of project very similar to this, where we're going to put out some prayers and rituals from the movement. But that's still, very early on in terms of working, but we're working on it. And, I just think to get some of the rituals, whether it's some of the communion liturgies or whether it's Las Posadas that many of our Latino brothers and sisters, observe around the Christmas time, or whether it's even like a Passover Seder, that kind of again touches on all of these kinds of themes. I'm also trying to work on a book of kind of essays around many of the strategic ideas coming out of the movement, and from especially my experiences over the past 3 decades organizing amongst the poor.
That could be really helpful for a lot of people, I think.
And so I'm
Benefit
hoping
from
that
your
will,
learning on that.
in about a year, that should be out. So looking forward to that. And then again, we at the Cairo Center are every week, we hold Bible studies and a Freedom Church of the Poor service. Really welcome people to come join that kind of online, but still deeply community-based and community-rooted community of movement activists, and those both that are kind of in the, in more formal religious institutions and churches, but also folks that have not found a place in church for a while because of the church's stance on so many issues. And so really invite people to come. You can go to the Cairo Center's Facebook page, and every Sunday at 6 p.m. You should join us. And then hope that folks really can turn up for June 18th. And we'll do a series of different both mobilization tour events. Both Bishop Barber and myself are coming, going to about 10 different places for really big kind of revivals and mass meeting tours between now and June. And then beyond then, we'll be continuing to kind of enliven and enlarge the electorate of poor and low income people, both for the midterms, but also just as we kind of build this movement from below.
Wonderful, wonderful. Wow. So again, the name of the book is We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign. And you can learn about that and all the work that Liz does at liztheoharis.org. So Liz, thank you so much for all your wonderful work. Just kind of, as I said, really inspiring, amazing what you've been able to accomplish and pull together. It takes a community, right? And you're building a community to do some wonderful things. So thank you so much, and thanks for sharing it with us.
Thank you for the interest and for the work you do. It's really good to be connected.
Thank you so much.